Let's go over some of the things you can do to set up your brand new practice in TotalMD. The first step is you want to add in the practice information. To do that, you'll click on File at the top left and then Program Preferences. Here in Program Preferences, you're going to type in your practice name, the address, phone number, and maybe the default area code. Default area code is nice because it'll save you the steps from having to type that in the future when you add in the patient's phone number. If you don't feel like you need a default area code, you can just remove that. The next step is to click on Program Settings at the top. And then here in the middle where it says Defaults, you can set up your default facility and default provider. This is really handy when you're a single provider office that only has one place of service that a practice is in. If you have multiple facilities and multiple providers, you don't need to set up a default. But if you do, it'll help save some steps in the future. To set up your brand new facility, just simply right-click here on Facility and then go to New Default Facility. Here it'll bring up the facility entry screen where you can type in the name, fill out the address, and then you want to make sure you add in the NPI number. Once you're done with this information, click on Save Changes and it brings you back to the program preferences, automatically defaulting to that facility you just set up. To add a new provider, do the same steps. Right-click on where the provider is and do New Default Provider or hit the F8 key. Here in the provider setup, you're going to want to enter in the provider's name. The address will be pulled from your practice address you set up earlier. You can change that if needed or just leave it the same. The other thing you want to enter in for the provider is under the IDs tab across the top. Here you want to be sure to add in the individual NPI and also group NPI if needed. You also want to add in that tax ID number and maybe even the social security number. This information will appear in the claim depending on how you've enrolled with your insurance payer. Once you're done setting up this provider, on the left side, click on Save Changes, and it'll bring you back to the program preferences and automatically have that provider you just entered in as the default. Now that you're done set up the practice, click on Save Changes, and it'll bring you back to the TotalMD home screen. Here at the top left, there's a menu item called Lists. Under this list, you can get to several areas of the program to enter in more information. For example, the provider list. If I click on that, you'll see the provider that we just set up is already there. If you wanted to add multiple providers, you can do that here by simply clicking on New Provider on that left side, and you can add in as many providers as you need. Let's jump down to setting up our CPT codes and our ICD-10 codes. They're here below where it says Service Code List and Diagnosis Code List. We'll start with Service Code List. Here my list is blank with the exception of attacks, which is added in there by default. But let's add in a procedure code of our own. On the left side, click on New Code or hit the F8 key. Here under your procedure code setup, type in the CPT code that goes here and then the description with it. Next, you want to change this type. Most likely it'll be fee for service, but if you want to distinguish the different procedures you have, you can use these other types. Once you've selected the type, more fields open up for you to enter in, and these are just the defaults for this particular procedure code. If, for example, whenever you do this code, there's always a modifier you add there, you can put this modifier here so it automatically defaults to it. All this information, however, is just a default, and you can always change it in the moment you're entering the charges or the service fees. Most likely you can leave these blank. The next step you want to do is click on the fee amounts right here, and you can set up your fee schedules. Typically, you're going to have one fee schedule, and you're going to type in the amount here that's going to be your charge. For example, for this office visit, we'll just charge $100. Now, the fee amounts and the contract amounts, or allowed amounts, are two different things. The fee amount is what actually appears in ledger that you're going to be charged, whereas the allowed amount or the contract amount is what the insurance says that they're actually going to pay you on. And that's something that we can enter in later. At this point, you don't really need to worry about that. Let's click on Save Changes, and it brings us back to our service code list. And here you can see that procedure code that I just set up. Let's add a diagnosis code now. Go back to List, then down to Diagnosis Code List. Here you see the same kind of setup here, but now it's for your diagnosis code. So on the left side, let's hit New Code or your F8 key on your keyboard. Here we'll set up a diagnosis code RV50.9, which is just your standard fever. This is all you really need to set up for your ICD-10 codes. If you wanted to link it back to ICD-9 codes and put those in there, you could. For the most part, this is all you really need. Click on Save Changes, and now it brings you back to the list. So here you can go through and you can add in all the ICD-10 codes that you need to bill your office. Those are the main areas that I would go through first when setting up your practice. Later on, we'll talk more about setting up patients and other areas of the program.